In the classroom of our nation's history, Americans are increasingly taught opposing views of founding presidents, such as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Were our nation's founders truly men of moral and religious character? And what role, if any, did their religious faith play in the founding of the American government? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage series. America, this is your heritage.
What you try to do when you want to separate a following from a leader is you attack the leader.
Yeah.
And you don't go after specifically what he says, you create tones about him. Same happens with George Washington. They say, oh, he's a deist. Well, religious people say, then I don't care what he said, you know. And that's a problem.
One of the other slanders is that he was a slave owner and all of that, and so that raises concern in a lot of people groups that he was a slave owner.
Yeah.
Truth be told, he was trying to abolish slavery.
You'll find that he was one of the leaders in ending slavery. Now, it's really hard for Americans to understand today. He lived in a state that would not allow him to emancipate his slaves. Now, he did when he died, but you have state laws in place that said you cannot free slaves. We actually have records of those who were freed by owners who, after the owner died, were put right back into slavery. It says, this is the natural condition of blacks. You have to have slavery. You cannot free them. That is illegal. He lived in a state that believed that. He did not believe that. You'll find that he signed the first federal anti-slavery law.
Wow.
This is also hard for us to understand. He owned really a couple hundred slaves. Most of them were given to him when he was between 12 and 14 years old. So he was given all these slaves. He went broke trying to make sure that they had adequate provision, that he took care of them, that he fed them. He would not sell them. He would not break families up. That was a huge economic burden to him, but he absolutely took care of his slaves as if they were family. Now, we can talk about whether slavery is right or wrong. He lived in a time where they would not allow him in that state to end slavery. Had he been in Massachusetts, he could have done it. But his sentiments were to end slavery. He called out for that. He asked for legislation ending slavery. He wanted a national abolition of it. One of the most amazing facts in American history is we came within one vote in the Continental Congress of abolishing slavery.
Wow.
One vote of ending slavery nationally. Because we did not get that one vote done, we kept slavery for another 120 years because we failed by one vote in Congress of abolishing slavery. So Washington is really a very anti-slavery person. It's a very difficult part of history. You can't condone slavery, but what he stuck with, he did a very good job. Matter of fact, he's the one that, as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, specifically went out and recruited African Americans to fight side by side. One of the great stories in American history is a black minister, Lemuel Haynes. Lemuel Haynes, wonderful story. Started churches all over New England, but when the war broke out, he left his pulpit, grabbed his rifle to fight the British side by side with George Washington. When he got back to his churches after the Revolution, Lemuel Haynes, African-American pastor, would preach a special sermon on George Washington, his commander-in-chief, with whom he had fought side by side in the American Revolution. You see, nearly 1/4 of the soldiers that fought in the American Revolution were black soldiers. They came in under Washington. If you look at a picture of Washington crossing the Delaware River, in the front of that boat, you have 2 black Americans there, served with Washington on the general staff from start to finish. They weren't slaves. They were soldiers. They were part of the general staff. They served right with him. That was the way it was. His thinking was not slavery. It was not oppression. His thinking was, I'm in a state that won't let me end slavery, so until we get that law passed, and he worked in the state legislature to get that law changed. Until we get that law changed, this is what I'm stuck with, but I will not treat individuals as slaves. These are going to be part of my family. I will economically take care of them. I'll go beyond what the state law allows me to do, and I'm going to work to end slavery in my state and my nation, and he did that. Another example of how revisionism attempts to misportray the religious faith of George Washington is seen in this ad from a national magazine. George Washington is called a Unitarian here rather than a Christian. The only problem with this charge is that it's not true. Consider these simple facts. All of George Washington's religious ties were to the Episcopalian Church, which clearly did not hold Unitarian beliefs. Furthermore, he died in 1799, and the Unitarians did not even organize until 1818, 19 years after Washington's death. While Washington's own writings and the eyewitness testimonies of his friends and co-workers confirm that George Washington was a Christian, perhaps the most concise confirmation of his faith comes from Nellie Custis, George Washington's own adopted daughter. Nellie lived with the Washingtons at Mount Vernon for 20 years, from her childhood until her own marriage. In a letter she wrote to Jared Sparks, a chaplain of Congress, Nellie confirmed Washington's Christianity.
George Washington attended church in Virginia at Alexandria when the weather and roads permitted a ride of 10 miles. While serving as president in New York and Philadelphia, he never omitted attendance at church in the morning unless detained by sickness. No one in church attended to the services with more reverential respect. I should have thought it the greatest heresy to doubt his firm belief in Christianity. His life, his writings prove that he was a Christian. And when my aunt died suddenly at Mount Vernon before they understood that she was dead, General Washington prayed most fervently, most affectingly for her recovery. Martha and George were perfectly united and happy, and Martha had no doubts, no fears for him. After 40 years of devoted affection and uninterrupted happiness in their marriage, she resigned George at his death without a murmur into the arms of his Savior and his God, with the assured hope of his eternal happiness in heaven. Is it necessary that anyone should prove General Washington claimed to be a believer in Christianity? As well may we question his patriotism and his devotion to his country.
Even though his daughter declared that you might as well question the patriotism of George Washington as question his Christianity, nevertheless, through the work of revisionists who ignore eyewitness accounts and documented writings, George Washington and other founding fathers have wrongly been labeled deists. As you've already seen throughout this tour of the Capitol, the historical records clearly prove otherwise. In fact, there is a room here at the Capitol which honors the faith of George Washington and which reflects the George Washington of a pre-revisionist era. That room is the Congressional Prayer Room, located just off the main rotunda. This prayer room was opened in 1954, the same year in which Congress added the phrase, "Under God," to the Pledge of Allegiance. This room is actively used today and therefore is not open to the public, so that it will always be available to those congressmen who want to use this room to pray and seek God. In the front of this room is an inspirational stained glass window portraying George Washington kneeling in prayer, a position that, according to Washington's friends and observers, was a frequent prayer posture for George Washington. Above his picture is the declaration, "This nation under God," and surrounding Washington is the Bible verse from Psalm 16:1 declaring, "Preserve me, O God, for in Thee do I put my trust."
In the classroom of our nation's history, Americans are increasingly taught opposing views of founding presidents, such as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Were our nation's founders truly men of moral and religious character? And what role, if any, did their religious faith play in the founding of the American government? Discover our nation's godly history in the American Heritage Series. America, this is your heritage.
The way we view a president and what that president does has a substantial impact on what we perceive to be constitutional today.
Right.
Especially with George Washington. Because here's a guy who's considered to be a father of the Constitution. That's what he was called in early generations. He is the man that was in charge of framing the Constitution. And the tone he sets is going to tell us a lot about what he believed to be constitutional. Now, this is really the case when you come to religious liberties, religious expressions, moral issues. There's so much documentation that we hear so little about today. This is a really cool paper because this is something that happened in the middle of the Constitutional Convention. This is from 1787. What had happened, the Constitutional Convention was starting to fall apart. Washington's friends were leaving. They were tired of the frustration, the arguments, the fighting. And so with all the bickering that had gone on, several delegates made proposals that we adjourn for a few days. Let's kind of cool off. Let's let this thing sit. They adjourned, and according to Washington's diary, not only did they adjourn for 3 days, they went to church in that period of time.
Wow.
And when they went to church, the Reverend William Rogers, they went to his church. It was called the First Calvinist Church, which we would today call the First Baptist Church, and they had the service there. What's really cool in this public newspaper is it records the prayer that he prayed over the Constitutional Convention. They've been fighting for days. Now they're here. Pretty impressive prayer. He says, "We fervently recommend to thy fatherly notice that august body assembled in this city who compose our federal convention. Will it please thee, O thou eternal I am, to favor them from day to day with thy immediate presence?" And he just went on to pray for them. Well, when they came back after that time of 3-day adjournment, prayer, sermons, the records indicate there was real